Washoe County Library System welcomes you to our monthly series from the Nevada Historical Society, presents High Noon with Neal Cobb. This afternoon's topic is about vintage fake news, Twain, DeQuille, hoaxes, and tall tales in Comstock newspaper, presented by Frank Mullen Jr. My name is Samantha, and I'm so happy to be here with you today. And now I'd like to introduce Sherry Hayes Zorn with the Nevada Historical Society. Again, welcome and thank you.
Hi, thank you, Samantha, so much, and welcome everybody for attending today's High Noon series. And we're so happy to be able to continue this wonderful program and being able to work with the Washoe County Libraries. It's allowed us to be able to give you a great variety of speakers from around the state as we continue to do this by Zoom. So we hope that you enjoy our monthly series. But I have to give a big shout out to our host, Neal Cobb, who is our honorary curator, and he's been such a longtime supporter of the Nevada Historical Society. We so appreciate his passion and love of history and helping support and share our story of history and how we help care for Nevada's heritage at the Historical Society. So let me introduce our amazing host, Neal Cobb. Hi, Neal.
Sherry, thanks for the intro. Always love it. Our speaker today, Frank X. Mullen, is a Reno-based investigative journalist, author, historian, adjunct professor, and a Chautauquan scholar. He was an editor and reporter for the Reno Gazette Journal for 25 years and is currently the editor of the Reno News and Review online. He taught part-time at the Reynolds School of Journalism at UNR for 15 years and now teaches continuing education classes at Truckee Meadows Community College. He is the author of the Donner Party Chronicles, a history of the Donner Party tragedy, and has appeared in programs on the History Channel, National Geographic, the BBC, the PBS, and other TV networks. He has twice been named Nevada's Outstanding Journalist by the Nevada Press Association and has won many state and national reporting and writing awards. His Chautauquan characters since 1998 include Babe Ruth, Henry VIII, Benedict Arnold, Edward R. Murrow, and Albert Einstein. He performs at Chautauquan festivals and community theaters in several states. So at this time, please welcome our speaker, Frank Mullen Jr.
Thank you, Neal. There's nothing new about fake news. Since ancient times, political rivals have been circulating false information about their opponents in whatever media was available, including clay tablets and wall graffiti. Fantasy has been passed off as fact since before the invention of writing. But in the Comstock, during the 1860s, what has been called the sagebrush school of newspapermen turned fake news into an art form. In Virginia City, lies became literature. Today, I'll be talking about two Washoe giants, William Wright, aka Dan DeQuille, and Samuel Langhorne Clemens, aka Mark Twain. Let's begin with William Wright. He was from a Quaker family in Pennsylvania, and his family relocated to Iowa. He was a natural storyteller who always had the writing bug. He married in 1853 at age 24, had 5 kids, but only 2 daughters survived childhood. He got published in a lot of local newspapers and small magazines. In 1858, William Wright left for the gold fields, and that was a bit late in the gold rush. He prospected from the Sacramento Delta to Yosemite, and then went into Nevada after the Silver Strike in 1859. He had been published in the Golden Era magazine and was building a reputation as a writer with descriptive articles and often humorous sketches of the characters he met in the gold fields. Back then, writers and humorists in particular had a tradition of nom de plumes, pen names. Wright tried a few before he settled on DeQuille. He went, for a while, he tried Picaroon Pax. And another one was Ebenezer Queer Cut. But those sounded funny, but didn't really do what he wanted to do. He finally settled on Dan DeQuille, Dandy Quill. In 1860, he joined the rush to Washoe after silver was discovered. I'm sorry, 1860, he joined the rush to Washoe after silver was discovered the year before. He did some prospecting, and in 1861, he got a job at a Virginia City mine, and that didn't last too long. Sam Clemens, meanwhile, came to Nevada in 1861 with his brother Orion, sometimes pronounced Orion. He was to be his brother's secretary, but he soon got bored with the bureaucratic job. He filed a lumber claim at Lake Tahoe because he heard you could make a fortune cutting down trees to make lumber for the mines. But that was actual work. So I think he lasted about half a day doing that. Then he went to Virginia City. He had done some writing for some Carson papers. But in 1862, he was hired by the Territorial Enterprise editor, Roland Daggett, and publisher Joe Goodman. And they hired him possibly to fill the shoes of Dan DeQuille, who had been fairly recently hired there himself, but before he took the job, he warned them he was going to visit his family in Iowa. So DeQuille worked for a while for the Virginia City Enterprise, the Territorial Enterprise, and then left for Iowa. And Twain, the new writer, gave him a send-off in the paper. And that already had some hoax quality to it. He claimed that DeQuille was a burnt-out shell of a man who had been done in by covering too many fights, murders, mine cave-ins, and the like, and had to go to Iowa to recuperate from the strain. When DeQuille returned months later, he and Twain became roommates in a boarding house at Virginia City owned by editor Daggett. It looks like, from reading the accounts of it and DeQuille's letters, it seemed to be kind of a frat house atmosphere. They played practical jokes on each other all the time and on the other tenants, and got in trouble for a few things. Their good-natured rivalry spilled onto the pages of the Enterprise. Once, when DeQuille had a relatively minor accident, Twain made the most of it. The headline on the story in the Enterprise was "Frightful Accident to Dan DeQuille." Dan DeQuille met with a disastrous accident yesterday when returning from American City on a vicious Spanish horse. The result of which accident is that he is at present confined to his bed and suffering great bodily pain. He was coming down the road at the rate of 100 miles an hour, as stated in his will, which he wrote shortly after the accident. And on turning a sharp corner, he suddenly hove in sight of a horse standing square across the channel. He signaled for the starboard and put his helm down instantly, but too late. He was swinging to port. Dan was wrenched from his saddle and thrown some 300 yards, alighting upon solid ground and bursting himself open from the chin to the pit of his stomach. His head also caved in and was out of sight. His hat was afterwards extracted in a bloody and damaged condition from between his lungs. He must have bounced end to end after he struck. One of his legs was jammed up in his body near to his throat, and the other so torn and mutilated that it pulled out when they attempted to lift him up in a hearse, which we had sent to the scene of the disaster. Both arms were broken up until they were jointed like bamboo. His back was considerably fractured and bent into the shape of a rail fence. Aside from these injuries, however, he sustained no other damage. What is left of Dan DeQuille will be around the brewery again today, just as usual. DeQuille got revenge on Twain in the pages of the Enterprise, and subjected him to the same kind of damage that Twain said he endured. There was a story called The Boxing Lesson. Twain met a visiting practitioner of the manly art who was giving lessons up in Virginia City. According to DeQuille's story, Twain tells the coach he could hold his own in the ring and not to hold back when sparring. You see it coming. Twain gets beaten to a pulp. But whatever damage was inflicted couldn't have been as bad as Dan's description, which closely resembled Twain's accident story about him. He describes several injuries that, if real, would have been fatal. He then speaks to Twain's permanent deformities, the worst being his nose. It was so flattened, it wasn't even there anymore. DeQuille reports that no one in Virginia City would talk to Twain on the street, meet his eye, or even glance at him from across the way. Children ran from him in terror, but Dan had a ready solution. He told Mark to go to a butcher and get a piece of veal and shape it into the shape of his nose and glue it on to his face with some pine tar. Such fictional reports were common, even expected in most newsrooms at the time. The tradition of humorous tales masquerading as news was accepted. Many newspapermen followed the example of the premier American humorist of the time. His name was Artemus Ward. His real name was Charles Farquhar or Farrar Brown. He's been called the nation's first stand-up comedian. Ward was a favorite author of U.S. President Abraham Lincoln. If you saw the movie Lincoln, there was a scene in the White House involving Lincoln before he presented the Emancipation Proclamation to his cabinet. Lincoln read aloud the latest episode from Ward called Outrage in Utica, also known as the high-handed outrage in Utica. Ward, by the way, visited Virginia City in 1863 during a trip to San Francisco. Writer Bret Harte was in the San Francisco audience that night and described Ward in a story in the Golden Era as capturing America's speech. He said Ward provided humor that belongs to the country of boundless prairies, limitless rivers, and stupendous cataracts. That fun which overlies the surface of our national life is met on the stage and in rail cars, canals, and flatboats, which burst out over campfires around barroom stoves. By the way, when Ward, in that San Francisco trip, performed in Virginia City, he met DeQuille and Twain and hung out with them after the performance. Legend has it that after midnight, Ward, Twain, and DeQuille got drunk and started climbing around the rooftops of Virginia City, jumping from roof to roof and shouting until a town constable threatened to blast all three of them with a shotgun full of rock salt. Ward stayed 3 weeks hanging out with Twain and DeQuille, and Ward later recommended Twain to the editors of the New York Press and urged him to journey to New York. But before that, Twain shook up the Comstock with some tall tales. Now, how do you tell a fable from real news? Both Twain and DeQuille always inserted clues into their phony stories. The petrified man story illustrates how Twain's clues were too clever by half. Back during that time, people were always finding new wonders in Nevada, new geographic wonders and all kinds of strange stories coming out of it. And the public was hungry for the next big wonder. At the same time, Twain was trying to make fun of the coroner over in Humboldt. So we made him a character in one of his fake stories. It had to do with the finding of a petrified man at Gravelly Ford out in the desert, which is a crossing of the Humboldt. You may be familiar with the Maiden's Grave out there. And they found this petrified man out there by the Humboldt River. And so people in the immediate neighborhood examined it and brought it into called the coroner in for it. And the inquest was held at the site because the man was fixed to the side of the cave and couldn't be moved. He was found to be in a state of complete petrification, Twain wrote, had been that way for over 10 generations. The verdict of the coroner's inquest was that the deceased came to his death from a protracted exposure, and water containing limestone had been trickling down the face of the stone against which he was sitting. All this stuff had run under him and cemented him fast to the bedrock and turned him into a stone man. The story was picked up by the California papers and was soon republished all over the country. Twain later said he filled the story with absurdities to provide hints. He says, I really had no desire to deceive anybody and no expectation of doing it. I depended on the way the petrified man was sitting to explain to the public that he was a swindle. Now, what Twain had done was describe the attitude of the man sitting against the cave wall. And in one sentence, he started talking about the way the man's hands were positioned. And then he left that part of his body to talk about the man's legs or torso. And then he came back to describe more about the hands and the position of the fingers and so forth. Then he went back and talked about the cave and then came back to the position of the hands. And here's a simplified version of what Twain was trying to tell people the man was doing when he was sitting against that cave wall. Twain later explained, but I was too ingenious. I mixed it up rather too much. And so all that description of the attitude as a key to the humbuggery of the article was completely lost, for nobody but me ever discovered and comprehended the peculiar and suggestive position of the petrified man's hands. I was stunned to see the creature that I had begotten, to pull down the wonder business with and bring mockery upon it, calmly exalted to the grand chief place in the list of genuine marvels that our Nevada had produced. The petrified man's story was harmless, but Twain learned nothing from his failure to make the clues more obvious. For example, the story about a massacre at Dutch Nick's probably should have gotten him fired from the newspaper. A news report that appeared in the Enterprise on October 28, 1863, details how advice to invest in San Francisco utilities rather than Comstock mining companies, which was advice that the San Francisco Chronicle gave people after a pump 'em and dump 'em stock scam was reported, resulted in tragedy for one man on the Comstock and his poor family. Twain wanted to make the point that the Chronicle's advice not to invest in the Comstock was hurting Virginia City residents, but he went way overboard with his parody. The headline was, and it contained a real person's name, cuts his throat from ear to ear, scalps his wife, and dashes out the brains of his 6 helpless children. And here's a part of the story. The lead says, from Abraham Curry, who arrived here yesterday afternoon from Carson, we learned the following particulars concerning the bloody massacre which was committed in Ormsby County the night before last. It seems like during the past 6 months, a man named P. Hopkins, or Philip Hopkins, has been residing with his family in the old log house just at the edge of the Great Pine Forest, which lies between Empire City and Dutch Nick's. About 10 o'clock on Monday evening, Hopkins dashed into Carson on horseback, with his throat cut from ear to ear, and bearing in his hand the reeking scalp from which the warm, smoking blood was still dripping, and fell into a dying condition in front of the Magnolia Saloon. Hopkins expired in the course of 5 minutes without speaking. The long red hair of the scalp he bore marked it as that of Mrs. Hopkins. Twain then described the carnage in more detail, and the horrible things that were found when the dead family members were discovered at the cabin next to the mansion, and provided quotes from 3 girls who survived the massacre. It was pretty convincing. The story was reprinted as fact in San Francisco and many other newspapers. When the hoax was revealed, other papers refused to take any more copy for the Enterprise for some time, and Twain offered to resign over it. But Goodman, the publisher, forgave him. He said, "We can supply people with news, or we can't supply them with sense." You know, that story was still on Twain's mind in 1879, and he took time to explain the joke. He says, it was a deep satire and most ingeniously contrived. Twain was always very modest. But I make the horrible details so carefully and conscientiously interesting that the public devoured them greedily and wholly overlooked the following distinctly stated facts, to which the murderer, who was a real person, was known to everyone as a bachelor and had no family to murder. And I talked about the splendid dressed stone mansion just at the edge of the great fine forest between Empire City and Dutch Nicks. And Twain writes, "Even the pickled oysters that came to our tables in Virginia City know that there's not a dressed stone mansion in all of Nevada territory. Also, that's so far from being that goes for being a great pine forest between Empire City and Dutch Nicks." And he defended himself by saying that for those not familiar with Comstock geography, he added another absurdity, which was, quote, that this diabolical murderer, after inflicting a wound upon himself, cutting his own throat from ear to ear, which a reader ought to have known would kill an elephant in a twinkling of an eye, jumped on his horse and rode 4 miles, waving his wife's reeking scalp in the air, and thus performing, entered Carson City with a tremendous shout and dropped dead in front of the chief saloon, to the envy and admiration of all beholders. Well, never in my life have I seen anything like the sensation that little satire created. It was the talk of the town. It was the talk of the territory, or in the West. Most of the citizens dropped gently into it at breakfast and never finished their meal. The readers never got to the part where the satire began. Nobody ever did. They found the thrilling particulars sufficient. To drop in with a little moral at the end of such a gorgeous massacre was like following the expiring sun with a candle in the hope to attract the world's attention to it. And Twain writes, "But I found out then, and never have forgotten since, that we never read the dull explanatory surroundings of marvelously exciting things when we have no occasion to suppose that some irresponsible scribbler is trying to defraud us. We skip all that and hasten to revel in the blood-curdling particulars and be happy." But once again, at the Enterprise, Twain learned nothing from all the trouble and continued to write both real and phony news stories. It was often hard to tell the difference. But the story that was the last straw for his newspaper career was a real story with one fake fact inserted. That was the piece about the sanitary ball in Carson City, an event that grew out of a real news story that Twain covered, involving the forerunner of the modern Red Cross, a flour sack, and a claim about interracial marriage that played upon the prejudice of people on both sides of the issue that had caused the Civil War. It all started with a flour sack. The flour sack had been originally part of a bet between a fellow named Gridley and a fellow named Herrick, both of whom lived in Austin. Gridley was a Democrat running for mayor, and the other fellow supported his opponent, the Republican Party. The bet was over whose party candidate would win the mayoral election. Gridley, running as a Democrat, said that if he lost, he would carry the flour sack on his back through town with brass band playing John Brown's body behind him. But if Herrick's candidate, the Republican, lost, Herrick would carry the sack with the band playing Dixie. After Gridley lost and held up his part of the bet, Herrick told him he didn't want the flower, and it was decided it should be auctioned off with the funds going to the Sanitary Commission, the forerunner of the Red Cross. Winners kept refusing to accept the sack, so it became a traveling show with Gridley auctioning it off again and again to benefit the sanitary fund. The ladies of Carson City, wives of mine owners and government officials, including Molly Clemens, Orion's wife, hosted a fancy dress ball to gather more donations. Twain got the assignment and thought it was boring, so he added some spice. His story was printed May 17th, 1864, and that was during the run-up to the November 1864 election, a time when partisanship in Virginia City was at its height and tempers were already on edge. The story was a pretty standard news piece, except for one sentence. He claimed in the story that the proceeds connected from the sanitary fund's ball might be secretly earmarked to help to support interracial marriage in the East. The article caused a sensation. Historian Ben Tarnoff wrote, Twain had located a sore spot in the collective psyche. The idea of sexual relations between the races, he says, wasn't simply taboo. It was tapped into an anxiety about the ultimate aim of the Civil War. That addition is missing from the archives, but there's a letter of reaction from the ladies in charge of the sanitary fund that came in a day or two later. The ladies write, in your issue yesterday, you state that the reason the flour sack was not taken from Dayton to Carson was because it was stated the money raised at the sanitary fancy dress ball recently held in Carson had been diverted from its legitimate course and was sent to aid a miscegenation society somewhere in the East. And it was feared the proceeds of the sack might be similarly disposed of. You mollify the statement later on by saying it was a hoax, but there is no effort made to divert those funds from their proper course. And by the way, Orion Twain's wife, Molly, was part of this group that staged the sanitary ball, so she was quite upset as well. Twain later claimed he had written it up while he was drunk, which people kind of believed if they know. But he said that after reflection, he decided not to turn the story in that way. But he said an editor found the copy on a countertop and mistakenly set it in type. The other newspapers, primarily the Virginia City Union, condemned him and demanded he be fired, maybe tarred and feathered, maybe hanged. The other Nevada newspapers piled on. Twain was challenged to no less than 4 duels. He apologized to his brother and sister-in-law, Molly, in a letter, and at the same time told them he'd overstayed his welcome in Virginia City and planned to leave for California. He also, in that letter, advised them against, quote, making speeches for the fund. I am mightily sick of that fund. It has caused me all kinds of damn trouble, and I shall leave the territory when your first speech is announced and leave it for good. The critics, by the way, kept piling on. One of them said in print, Twain had no gentlemanly sense of professional propriety. Every word and every purpose of all his words shows such a groveling disregard for truth, decency, and courtesy as to seem to court distinction of only being understood as a vulgar liar. Twain started carrying a pistol again. And when the editor of the Union railed against him and insulted his manhood, Laird, the editor, stuck to his words, and then Twain challenged him to a duel. The reigning loudmouth of Washoe, they called Twain, still infamous from the Carson massacre hoax. So on Sunday, May 29th, 1864, Twain, having quit the Enterprise, boarded the stagecoach and began his journey out of Nevada Territory to San Francisco. No duels were ever fought. The Jumping Frog and the national spotlight awaited him in Calaveras County. Many Nevadans, including the editor of the Gold Hill Evening News, were happy to see the back of him. In an editorial on May 30th, 1864, the editor wrote, "Among the few immortal names of the departed, that is, who departed yesterday morning per California stagecoach, we notice that name of Mark Twain. We don't wonder. Mark Twain's beard is full of dirt and his face is black before the people of Washoe. He gives way to the idiosyncratic eccentricities of an erratic mind." And so that left Dan DeQuille as the primary Aesop of the Comstock. Dan DeQuille called his fake stories quaints. He thought of them as a sort of American versions of the Baron von Munchausen stories in Europe. One of his quaints was the Silver Man, which was a reimagining of Twain's Petrified Man story. He created that elaborate quaint for the February 5th, 1865 edition of the Golden Era. He peppered his account with accurate scientific and geological facts gleaned from his knowledge of mining and extensive reading to provide a lot more foundation to the tale. The story is that prospectors made a great discovery in a mine between Owens River and Esmeralda County in what's called the Hot Springs Lead. What they found was the body of a man stretched out on the ground, lying face up, almost perfect, even to the fingers and toes. The body was petrified, and when the right arm broke off during its extraction, DeQuille invented a prospector witness, a Mr. Coleman, who assayed the limb and determined it to be a, quote, mass of sulphuret of silver, slightly mixed with copper and iron. DeQuille said the remains were that of a Native American man who centuries before went into the cave to get out of a raging storm. The storm triggered a landslide, trapping the man, and through the ages, his body gradually was mineralized, transforming into the Silver Man. Quote, for us in this age to wonder about. Another famous quaint was the Traveling Stones of Pahranagat Valley. And that's in the wildest and most sterile portion of southeastern Nevada, near Death Valley. And he claimed that some years ago, a prospector went there and brought back with great curiosity in the shape of a number of traveling stones. The stones are almost perfectly round, the majority of them, he says, as large as a whole walnut and very heavy, being of some sort of iron ore in nature. When scattered about on the floor or table or other level surface, within 2 or 3 feet of each other, they immediately begin traveling towards a common center. And Twain says they huddled up bunch-like eggs in a nest. A single stone removed to a distance of a yard upon being released at once started off with a wonderful and somewhat comical motion to rejoin its fellows, but if taken 4 or 5 feet away, it remained motionless. And he goes on to explain that the man found them on a level surface. There was nothing there with bare rock, and that there were several little basins where the stones gathered like little eggs in a nest. And the size of the stones were the size of walnuts, the size of a pea, and a few were even larger. And he says these curious pebbles appear to be formed of lodestone or magnetic iron ore, according to the assayers. Now, DeQuille thought that this was too incredible on its face for anybody to believe it. But he got letters from universities and scientists and others for years asking for samples of the stones. It is said that P.T. Barnum himself wanted to buy the stones for $10,000 as long as, quote, it was possible to get them to perform under a circus tent. But that's probably another one of DeQuille's fake news items. But many people did write him about the stones, including folks from Europe. He always replied that the story was a hoax, and then they accused him of trying to keep an important discovery to himself. By 1872, abandoned telling letter writers the truth and instead begged interesting parties to contact Mark Twain, who probably still has on hand 15 or 20 bushels of the stones in assorted sizes and is happy to give them away. Still, DeQuille got letters for years. On November 1879, he finally published a full confession, and he, tongue-in-cheek, cursed the stones as diabolical cobbles. No matter, the letters kept coming. One of my favorite DeQuille stories is the solar armor. That story had to do with an inventor named Jonathan Newhouse, who constructed a suit made of India rubber and sponges. The garment consisted of a jacket and a hood. The hood was made, fit over the head, and be sealed at the neck, and had a tube exiting from the top that was connected to an enclosed water bag to be worn under the wearer's left arm. The wearer could squeeze the water bag with his elbow and circulate the water, thus cooling his body. The inventor set off on a march across Death Valley to test his apparatus. He did not return. A Paiute led searchers to his remains. Quote, "He was dead and frozen stiff," DeQuille wrote. Quote, "His beard was covered with frost, and though the noonday sun poured down its fiercest rays, an icicle over a foot in length hung from his nose. There he had perished miserably because his armor had worked but too well, and because it was laced up behind where he could not reach the fastenings." DeQuille later claimed the London Times picked up the story, and the editorial writers suggested that this latest miracle of the scientific age be issued to Her Majesty's troops in India. That's another fable, as far as I can tell. But the London Daily Telegraph did pick up the item, but they were very skeptical. On August 3rd, 1874, the Telegraph ran DeQuille's piece, but went on to write, "The marvelous stories which come from the plains are apt to be received with incredulity. We should require some additional confirmation before we unhesitatingly accept it." And that writer goes on to say, it's kind of credible because everyone knows if you take a bottle of wine and wrap it in a damp cloth and put it in a draft, the wine's going to get colder than you ever expected. So maybe it's true, maybe it's not, the Telegraph said. Now, the London Daily Telegraph at the time had the largest circulation of any newspaper in the world. So DeQuille was thrilled that his story made it into that paper. He wanted more ink from him. So he penned an update to the case of Mr. Newhouse, which was published in the Territorial Enterprise on August 30th, 1874. Rather than retracting the tale, DeQuille doubled down. Quote, "We're glad that the Telegraph has given us the opportunity long awaited of publishing in detail the sequel to this curious affair. We received a letter in regard to the matter from the coroner. At the inventor's camp was found a carpet bag full of chemicals, including ether and other liquids. So the apparatus wasn't meant to circulate just plain water, which leads us to the conclusion that Newhouse fell victim to a rash experiment with chemicals, the nature of which he was imperfectly acquainted. The chemicals were sent to the Academy of Sciences at San Francisco for analysis, and I await the result." And to this day, the results have never come. So in that case, DeQuille, who enjoyed the international exposure, tried to keep the hoax alive. Usually, though, the tales were meant to be humorous and ephemeral. Dan remained at the newspaper while Twain became internationally famous, but they both remained friends. And in the 1870s, Twain helped DeQuille get his book, The Big Bonanza, published, but it didn't sell well. And Dan remained a newspaper man in Virginia City for 30 years, while his friend traveled the world as a famous author. But DeQuille and the others at the Enterprise did attain recognition for what is now called the Sagebrush School of Frontier Journalism and Humorous Stories. The Sagebrush School, by the way, as a group, are in the Nevada Writers Hall of Fame, as are DeQuille and some of the others, Alf Doughton, and Twain, and some others from the Enterprise made up that Sagebrush School. As the mining boom faded and the local population dwindled, the Enterprise forged on, changing hands several times. It ceased publication on January 16th, 1893, with the epitaph, "For sufficient reasons, we stop." DeQuille, who struggled with alcoholism, continued to write short stories and several novellas. In failing health, he retired to Iowa in 1897 and died in 1898. The difference between the fake news of the Comstock and what we see today is that although Twain and DeQuille's tall tales and hoaxes often fooled people, they were meant to entertain, not deceive. Although DeQuille often compounded the situation, as he did with the solar armor, to keep the story alive. Twain, who spent less than 2 years in Nevada, became a national icon. Wright, who stayed, introduced the nation to the Silver State. Even today, critics and scholars continue to consider his tall tales more humorous than those of his protege Twain. In the aftermath of the Civil War, he made a shell-shocked nation laugh and recorded the history of Nevada, a legacy passed on to generations beyond time. Publisher Joe Goodman, who had employed both scribblers, later said regretfully, quote, "Isn't it so singular that Mark Twain should live and Dan DeQuille fade out? If anyone had asked me in 1863 which was to be an immortal name, I should unhesitatingly said Dan DeQuille." And if you're interested in DeQuille or the Comstock or the Sagebrush School, this is a pretty good biography. Dan DeQuille, the Washoe Giant, by the two Richards, Dwyer and Lingenfelter. That's been around for a while. And coming out next year, 2 books about this very topic. Monumental Lies, Early Nevada Folklore in the Wild West by Ron James, who's a former state historic preservation officer and also teaches at UNR, and Frontier Fake News, Nevada's Sagebrush Humorists and Hoaxsters by Richard Moreno, who is the former editor of Nevada Magazine. Both of those are going to be published by the University of Nevada Press early next year. And so thank you for tuning in, and be safe in your travels. If there are questions, I'll try to answer them.
That was wonderful, Frank. That was a great presentation, and it's so funny. I'm so glad you brought that up, because I actually was talking with Ron and Bob Stewart last week, and then we also have Richard Moreno scheduled for a Writers Wednesday this coming October during Nevada Day, our event. So I was very excited to see both of those books. So for your years of experience, are you of the same opinion that Dan DeQuille was the better writer and humorist than Twain?
Well,
what are your thoughts? So.
Yeah, I think Twain was definitely the better writer. But in terms of just limiting it to those tall tales and limiting it to newspaper writing, what Joe Goodman saw, in Virginia City, DeQuille was definitely the better journalist. He was the better journalistic writer and nonfiction writer. And also when it came to his tall tales, just limited to that, he was better than Twain. Twain at the time was kind of stumbling around, and as I said, often went overboard. It just went completely wild on the gore and all that, and buried his clues. So just in that, small bracket of Virginia City, DeQuille was definitely the greater of the two. And Twain didn't give a damn about nonfiction writing or journalism. He grudgingly, performed those tasks, but that wasn't really his thing. Whereas DeQuille really took to it, and 30 years in the newspaper business, which used to impress me until I realized I've been in it 40 years. So much for that.
All right, I have several questions for you. Are you aware of any hoaxes, kind of this nature, that you talked about, that's been published in Nevada the past 40 to 50 years that you're aware of?
Not lately. I mean, there were stories that came out that were later proven to be incorrect. People often tried to get me, well, any reporter at the Gazette-Journal, to do fake stories. There was a guy who called me late at night on a Friday. Actually, I got a press release first by fax back in those days, and it said that where they were building a development in South Reno, construction workers had come across some fossils, and they called in a paleontologist, and they turned out to be an unknown dinosaur. And it went on like DeQuille with all these technical things woven through it. And it sounded really, really authentic. And it was signed by someone who purported to be the consulting paleontologist. And the man's name was Felix Cooperlight. And the thing had come in, and Jim Sloan, who was the night editor at the time, came running up to me and said, I know you're interested in, history and paleontology, and this has just come in, call this guy. And I called the number on there, and there was no answer. And he said, well, let's run it. We could follow up with a greater story when you can contact them, when we get a picture of the fossil and so forth. And I said, we're not running it. And I took the fax and crumpled it up and threw it in the wastebasket. And Jim's like, what's wrong with you? And I took it out of the wastebasket and I flattened it out. I said, you see who the paleontologist is? He said, yeah, Felix Cooperlight. And I said, okay, that means lucky dinosaur droppings. And I didn't say droppings. And so people were constantly trying to get us to publish fake information. And when we vetted it, we'd not do that. We would always check things out. There's a saying I teach my journalism students is, if your mother says she loves you, check it out. So don't believe anything that comes in, email, fax, over the phone, personal in-person statements. Check everything out before you print it. On the national scene, there have been a lot of hoaxes, though. There was that reporter at the New York Times that made up stories out of whole cloth, including fake people. And sometimes he took real, like Twain did, took real people and put them in fake situations and quoted them, and stuff. So there have been hoaxes perpetrated to this day, and when they're caught, they make big headlines. And it really hurt the New York Times. And what was that movie about the magazine where the guy made up all his stories, and he was the darling of the New Republic or whatever magazine that was. And then it came out that most of his stories were made up out of whole cloth. And he had cover stories for years, and just was a better fiction writer than a newspaper man or a magazine writer. But it took him a while to get caught.
That's pretty amazing. So there is a question. You mentioned, that Dan DeQuille and Mark Twain lived together, but you referred to him as Dan and Josh because they were roomies. So why was he called Josh? Do you know?
That was the first pseudonym, the first nom de plume that Twain used in print in Carson City, and then later on in the New Era and the Enterprise. And so, like DeQuille, he had tried a couple of fake names, pen names prior. And so at the time they moved in together, he was known as Josh. DeQuille was already DeQuille. And then I forget what date, but at some point that Mark Twain's byline first appeared in the Enterprise shortly thereafter.
Okay. Do you know who Artemisia Ward, what was his real name? That
Artemis
was another
Ward.
question.
Yes. What did I say? He had kind of a unusual middle name. His real name was Charles Farrer Brown, Browne. And Artemis Ward, by the way, was a general. I don't know why he chose Artemis Ward, but there was a real person named Artemis Ward who was a military officer, and I guess Brown admired him or whatever, and took his name. I think he spelled his first name differently with a U instead of an I, as compared to the general, but that was his name. Died young too. He was like 33 when he died.
Okay. So I have another question. What grave at Humboldt River? Where did you find the photo of the petrified man when you were talking about the story?
Which one? Which photo? There were
She
like
said,
3 of them on this.
yeah, I was wondering that too, because you did have a
There's
few.
one here. This is Pompeii.
I thought that was Pompeii, that one,
That's
but I think,
Pompeii. And then
yeah.
this one is Pompeii.
Oh, is it?
So they're
Okay.
not really petrified. I mean, they are, but they're not from the West. They're kind of like what Twain and DeQuille described, but they're real, and they're rather than being fossils, they're where the lava or the ash, I guess, filled in the cavities made by these people who were caught. Some of them in mid-flight when the Vesuvius erupted.
Yeah, because I've seen other pictures. I was wondering if at least one was from Pompeii, but I didn't realize
Yeah, both of them.
were.
Yeah.
Okay. Can you talk a little bit about Joe Goodman? You had that great picture of him from 1939. I know he then sells the paper, and but do you know a little bit about his backstory?
You know, I did. Hang on. But no, I don't recall. He had a storied career after the Enterprise. I know that, but I didn't really dwell on Goodman and what happened to him later on. And he is considered a member of the Sagebrush School. And he lived quite a long life. He didn't die, I don't think, till 1940s.
Okay. Yeah, I thought he did some other things, but I just didn't know.
Yeah, he did. And I briefly read that, in a paragraph, but that was 8 years ago when I researched DeQuille. So it's not exactly on the top level.
So then another question is, did Dan DeQuille, because you were talking about the quaints, his stories, did he start writing those before Twain, or was that kind of, they were both doing it at the same time or afterwards? I was kind of curious how that
It was
worked out.
always a part of DeQuille's writing. A lot of the profiles he wrote for the new the magazine in California and for newspapers, he would do personality profiles kind of people, and he would always exaggerate. The way Twain did about him crashing at 100 miles an hour on a horse. Although Twain's or DeQuille's stuff was always more subtle. And so he always had an element of fiction in his reporting in the gold fields. Whether it was an incident or a person, he would embellish it to make it more interesting. And he would, I'm sure, make up quotes, because he would have long monologues said by people. And I doubt if he was sitting around the campfire taking notes. He used his memory, and then he sat down and recreated it and added a lot to it in the vernacular. So he was always half a fiction writer, but putting specific stories that were meant to entertain wasn't until he got to Virginia City. But like I said, Artemis Ward and a lot of other writers at the time did that. There was a guy in France who claimed to have built a telescope and found bat people on the moon. And that was a huge international hoax because it was published in Paris on the front page. An illustrator made drawings of the bat people flying around the craters of the moon. And it was picked up in this country and it was believed. And like DeQuille's work, that had a certain aspect of, scientific fact in it. And so people were used to being, oh, wow, the telegraph, how the heck does that work? They're going to do a transatlantic cable? My God, what an age we live in. And so people were ready for the next big scientific, advance. And so that guy in France really took, and then that generated a whole host of other hoaxes in this country. So it was a big deal for a while. You really couldn't know who to believe, even in, well-established newspapers in the eastern cities. They ran this and people went, wow, bat people on the moon. How wonderful.
Kind of like the moon's made of cheese.
Yeah. Yep.
So Neal, you raised your hand, so you were going to ask something?
Yes. On the introduction, I wanted to expand just a little bit and talk about his outreach to the community and the good that he has been able to do. And I'd like him to elaborate just a little bit on a good friend of both of ours that he covered many stories on, John Champion.
Oh, yeah. John Champion had a machine shop down by the Truckee River. It was close to where the old newspaper office was. John was a one-man ecological force who did everything he could to clean up the river. I would see him in there because I only work a couple blocks away. He'd be in there with waders on, like he was going fly fishing, but what he was doing was taking trash out of the river. He was an advocate for making the river an attraction for Reno. And at the time when I first moved here, the river, businesses along the river turned their backs to the water.
Yes.
In the late 1800s, the Truckee River was an open sewer. There were all kinds of garbage in it. After the Clean Water Act came out, it got cleaned up to a great degree. But also the Corps of Engineers had come in the 50s and 60s and rechanneled it and turned it into, from a flowing, meandering river, into a fire hose leading out of the city. They wanted to get the floodwaters the heck out of there. And so Champion lobbied for that river to become an attraction. And but since then, there's been the Conservancy put the meanders back in the river east of Reno. We've got the river walk. It is an attraction now, like it is in other cities where they have a river, they take advantage of it. And Reno really didn't do that up until probably the late 90s, when people started saying, yeah, we got this wonderful river and, we treat it like a garbage dump. So Champion was a big force in that. And he was also an outdoorsman. He made a lot of his own, he trapped beaver.
Yeah, and the Helms Pit.
Hides.
Yeah.
And stretched, he'd go in his machine shop and he'd have stretched hides of beaver up there. And I borrowed one when I played a mountain man for Chautauqua, Caleb Greenwood. Yeah, John was a great guy, and unfortunately he died of a heart attack. I'm not quite sure of the year. I believe it was 99, but I'd have to look it up. But
we were able to build that wonderful park in his name.
Yeah, at the Gazette Journal. As a matter of fact, that year I wrote a series about the Truckee River, the history of it, and what things were being done, including Champion. We made it an advocacy journalism kind of thing. Yeah. The paper said, we are in favor of making this river an attraction and getting it back to somewhat of a natural state, rather than a concrete ditch. We sponsored the building of John Champion Park after he passed away, and that's still there and in use. And the publisher at the Gazette Journal at the time formed a committee And it was, Truckee River, I forget the name of it, but it was basically to revitalize the Truckee River. And so the newspaper had a big part in that. And I was privileged to be the main writer of all that, and also privileged to know John Champion.
Yes. Good job.
Oh, that's amazing. Oh, I have. Wonderful. Oh, yes. And also, Lorraine wanted to comment. Thank you so much for your talk, and thanks for wearing one of our Nevada Historical Society shirts.
I also have a sweatshirt. I've got a full ensemble of Nevada
Nice.
Historical
Nice.
Society.
So, all right, there is another question. With the Sagebrush School, was Sam Davis, is he considered part of that since he came on later? Or do you know?
I don't think so. I think it was the earlier writers. If you saw that group photo,
Yeah.
was on there. The Historical Society has that. It was more of the earlier 1860s guys and into the early 1870s. And of course, DeQuille was there the whole time. But it's more back in the Civil War and just immediately post Civil War era.
Okay, that's what I was wondering with the picture, but I just didn't know if they kind of continued that a little bit later.
And it was only called the Sagebrush School afterwards. I mean, it wasn't like they got together and said, "Hey, we're the Sagebrush School." I mean, it was one of those things that evolved.
Okay, so would you consider that just Virginia City?
Well, Artemis Ward was an honorary member.
Okay.
I mean,
What about Henry Meagles?
That did the same kinds of things.
Okay.
But the movement, that frontier journalism, things reported in the vernacular, rather than this stilted journalistic prose that you would have seen in New York Times during that period. And also the humorous stories that were pioneered by Artemis Ward. So those things, after that was done a long time, and Virginia City was the nucleus of it, it got recognized as a movement, the way art movements are, afterwards you're like, ooh, let's call that Impressionism or postmodernism or, whatever. They got kind of clumped together as a trend.
Okay. And so when you mentioned that, who was it that they thought Dan DeQuille would be more famous? Was that Goodman?
That was Goodman.
Yeah. Okay.
And he says at the time, he would have said that. I don't think he meant that for the rest of Twain's career. He claimed that DeQuille was, the better writer. He was talking about at that time, you got two guys working for you. They're both making their mark, but one of them is head and shoulders over the other one. And so his prediction would have been completely wrong.
Okay. Well, this was a great talk, Frank. Thank you so much. And I know it was just, I've been looking forward to this presentation and hearing more stories about these gentlemen. And I hope everyone has enjoyed the program today, and we had some good questions. So thank you so much for attending, everyone. And as always,
I'm sure people noticed that picture of the man with the solar armor freezing in Death Valley. You know where that was from.
It's a Star Wars.
No. Jack Nicholson in the end of The Shining.
What?
Yeah,
no, really?
He was in the hedge maze, and then the camera comes in on him, and he's got icicles hanging from his nose.
Okay.
He's frozen in there, and when I saw that movie, I'm like, oh my God, the solar armor. There it is. Although
there it is. Okay.
Armor on, but he was sitting there, frozen to death.
Oh, frozen. Oh, I love that. That's too funny. Yeah, because I was looking at that picture and I was trying to figure out what it might have been taken from.
Yeah, that was just a quick cut and paste job of Jack
Nice.
with a shot of
Okay. That was good. I like that. Well, let me thank the Washoe County Libraries again for being such great supporters and for helping us tell our monthly series through Zoom. And I will send it back to Samantha to finish this up. And once again, thank you, Frank. A great program today.
Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us today. If you're interested, you can check out Frank's book, The Donner Party Chronicles from the Washoe County Library. The link has been added to the chat. Thank you, Sherry Hayzorn, Neal Cobb, and Frank Mullen Jr. with the Nevada Historical Society, and John, our Washoe County Library Systems Tech Wizard, for making this event possible today. Thanks again. Have a good one.